So my mother is Cree Métis, and that means that she's a mix of Cree and some French. And so I'm Cree Métis French. Métis means, in the truest sense of Métis, is you're connected to the Louvière movement. I was not very connected to it, other than watching my grandmother bead and watching my mother do a little bit of snaring rabbits and that kind of thing. They lived off the land. I didn't. When I came to art, I said in my application, I will be interested to see if my Indigenous heritage comes out in my art. And it didn't for the first 3 years. But just this last year, it's really come out. And it's almost kind of what I'm really focused on. So the 215 children refers to the 215 children that were found on the grounds of a residential school in British Columbia. Those are children who were taken from their parents, who were required by law to go to a school, pulled away from their culture, their roots, and, as the saying goes, take the Indian out of the Indian child. When the story broke about the 215 children, that was when the knife went into my solar plexus, and I started to think more about how painful that would have been for my grandmother and my aunt, who was very involved in the raising of my mother. And I started to ask my mother more questions. It's a process of exploration and discovery and of reconnection to this heritage that I really, don't know a lot about. As my mother said, her culture was taken from her, so she doesn't have much of the culture left. And she went to residential school up in Fort Chipewyan, which is 200 kilometers away from Fort McMurray. And when I saw that 200 kilometers on a map, I realized, wow, she was 7 years old. But that's a long way. That maybe my life's work is to give voice to the children who were lost. I love land, whether it's here, Australia, Europe, wherever. I always look for the land and the connection. My connection to the land is very strong. So I think that comes through into my sculpture. And maybe that comes in through some of the movements. I really very much feel the energy of the earth in particular. And I do think that comes out in my sculptures. I always visualize as if it's coming through the earth to me. The first paper dress that I made in your class was Clarion Call, and she was purposely transparent because I was thinking about the inside of us and the pain, and how we have skin, and it's so hard sometimes to see through the skin, to see the pain. We put on a facade and we go through our day trying to not feel the pain or show the pain. And then the second one, which is the model for Undaunted, it was like I was a channeler, I think that's the word. And it was late at night, and it felt like the spirits were, my ancestors were with me, really. That's what it felt like. And so, some of the things that you said about, like, art saves lives. Well, partly it saves my life through letting my ancestry come through me and be communicated in a visual language, which that's another difference. My other work was very much about oral language, about speaking. I really thought there was only one way of language, but now I've learned that there's this whole visual language. So learning to communicate through this visual language has been a really interesting process, and learning to let the interaction, I guess, between the media and whatever it is that's coming through me meld and just let them be.
Yeah. Good job.
Good job. Thank you, Roy. Oh my God, my heart.
Great.
So what did you think of the marble when you finally saw it for the first time?
I was surprised. You didn't know what to expect. I had some ideas of how smooth it would be, about how much I would have to work where the machine couldn't reach, and it followed along in some ways. But in other ways, like there was a lot more interest, I think, in.
So can you describe what some of the things that happened with the machine?
Well, the big part was like the mill paths, the way the tool works. It kind of runs by its own logic that maybe you don't think initially. Like I want to make it like this, but then it does something else. And then there's different ranges in the sculpture that were really fascinating. Some parts were like beautifully crisp, then some parts were very like kind of almost wide and abstract. The sculpture definitely started as this kind of core idea of involving myself, my body, and my culture, and kind of this bit of disconnect that I feel. It's all about, and on both a technological and a conceptual angle, it's kind of me and my culture getting bashed together in a way and trying to see how they interact. So I've in the sculpture, there's two components. There's a scan of myself, and then I've got this scan of a like an heirloom chest, soon to be heirloom. It's got all these beautiful carvings of lion dogs and like lotus leaves and ribbon, and it's kind of been like a point of fascination of mine since I was a kid because it's been in the house all the time. You're always feeling it, touching it, and it's kind of like one of these doorways into parts of my culture that I don't quite feel in tune with anymore. The initial premise of the pose and the composition was that, much like how the chest was kind of like, a bit of a connection for me, the lion dance has always been something that's very interesting to me as well. I think it's beautiful. I think it's incredible. I don't know how to do it. I don't do it myself. And in some ways, when I experience it, I feel like I experience it as an outsider. It's something that I look in at. It's not something I embody. So I thought, surely this is the time to try to embody it. So that's kind of what the gesture is like, cropped out of a two-person performance. The person in the front has the head and they hold it up. The person in the back holds onto the hips, and then together they become the dragon dance.
So then when the marble came, there was some refining that had to happen by hand. How did that feel to you?
It was exciting. It was really exciting. And I really, really relished in the hand tools, in the feeling and the noises it made. Like the power tools were already kind of scary in some ways. You worry about damaging it, but with the hand tools there's a real intimacy, I think, and especially when it's my own body in a way, as amorphous and changed as it was. The most important part for me was still kind of the process of the making. Went through so many ideas, and then the scanning and the different forms as well, because the journey feels very important as well to it.
Could you imagine that sculpture being a very large public commission?
I think especially with body forms, there's a very interesting effect as you get bigger or smaller than real life. I think in an ideal world, I would have made it the exact size of myself. But the bigger you make the body and the smaller you make it, really starts to change how you're perceiving it. And I think that kind of, it plays a bit maybe with like the empathy of like when something is small, you have a hard time envisioning being it. When something is big, you have a hard time envisioning being it. But once it's right at that perfect level, you can kind of feel the motion, feel what it would be like to hold that pose, what it would be like to be there.
So this morning we had a visit with John Isherwood. Did that bring up some thoughts or implications?
It was definitely interesting. I think he has a lot of great things and a lot of great thoughts about the technology aspect of it. And I've kind of got some ideas for a new projects.
Your family is really important to you. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like your role in our community as an artist and your role in your family as an artist?
Well, I'm always endlessly grateful for my family and how they've supported me in my art especially. And I definitely feel like I fill a role, or I'm important in bringing art to us.
The material, the experience, the physical material with your hands on them is where you get the greatest satisfaction.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's probably what I think about first and foremost. And then when I'm working with whatever material it is, sometimes it's repetitive, so it becomes sort of meditative, and you think about the history of that material or what it would have done when you kind of took it from its regular job type thing. But yeah, so I think about that mostly when I'm working. where it came from, whose hands maybe made that material prior to my getting it.
The sculpture that you're working on for the residency right now is
Yeah.
part of a series.
Yeah.
The saddle form, and
Yeah.
then the saddle form transcending itself.
I think the form still, I don't know why, I still find it really intriguing to work with, and sometimes I think, oh, I should do something else, but I'm drawn back to it all the time. And I think with that saddle tree taken out of context, so not sitting on a horse's back and tipped up, becomes very figurative and female, I think. And using that sort of as the base or the motivating factor, I think that for me, I've just touched the surface of things, literally, because it's such a new thing to be working like a sculpture program that's on the computer. I'm just at the very beginning of figuring that out. And yeah, I think it opens up the possibility to do a lot of different things. Originally, I started with the saddle tree form and crocheted doilies that were made by both my grandmothers. I noticed as I was working on this and trying to refine some of the areas around the pattern of the doilies, that I was remembering, my grandmother sitting and crocheting these doilies and how they had a practical use and I guess a decorative one at the same time, right? And
Like you have a saddle tree that's got the actual crochet on it, that has a certain kind of presence. When you go to the marble, do you feel like it has a different kind of longevity going into the future?
for sure, it feels it will last throughout time. It's a monument or a testament to the history of some of the people in my family. The marble feels a bit more precious. It's easy to take away what's there and have it be gone with the
Dust in the wind.
the dust or one swipe of the wrong file or something. I think I feel an obligation to be really careful when I'm doing it and make sure that I preserve how they look and
When you're doing the motions, sometimes I like watching you. These small, on these particular pieces, there's a lot of repetitive motion that's not unlike.
yes,
I don't know.
and it almost feels like you're making them again, right? Making them over. New materials are always interesting. How you respond to it, what you can do with it, how far you can push it. And I think that, Michelangelo or somebody who's worked in marble would have worked years to finish, right?
Yeah.
And we have the technology to do it in a much shorter period of time. It's nice when people look at something and maybe don't recognize what it is at first, and then after a little bit more looking, a little bit more investigation, they understand, and that moment of understanding is always great for me, and it's nice to see that surprise that people have. I think that's one of the great things about art.
I started with clay, which is a plastic material, and when that becomes stone, then it can hold marks in a different way, and it responds to the tool in a different way. So I'm trying to leave some of that energy that comes from the tools and the working with the stone, even the accidents or the unpredictable things in there. And I think that tells more than it would if it was clay or something. It shows an evidence of energy put in. And I guess that's something that I care about.
So you're making kind of, those marks are evidence of moments that you've been alive, in a way.
Evidence of chaos, of energy, of
Choice.
stubbornness.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a hard material to look natural, to look like it was created with ease. And I think that's what I'm working with right now.
You're talking about getting along with the material.
Getting along with the material, getting something out of it that looks like you didn't have any part to play within its creation. I think the material changes the person that approaches it, just like a musical instrument will change you. There's, for one thing, only so many things that are achievable depending on your skill level or your imagination, but then there's also what the material will allow, what the instrument will allow. And I think that once you get going with it, it can lead you to a place where you're talking to the material, you're in conversation with the material. I like seeing what you can do with it, and how far you can take it in terms of detail or form, or pushing it to the boundary of strength. The hardness of marble is something that I find useful, because it will sort of do what you want it to do in the end and hold that, but it won't change rapidly. It's becomes a collection of a lot of time and consideration and work put in. So the machine had it changed the form a little bit. It softened it, I found. Creases and hard lines were softer, and that allowed me to take different routes and make different decisions. Left me some material to work with, but just seeing that difference sparked things in my imagination where I thought, oh, here's a different way to go. So I followed that. So I just think it's a little crazy to take one of the most valuable materials and then treat it like it's disposable. But I think that's the kind of attitude that I value in getting something good. Because if I treat it too valuable, then I'm going to be afraid to take away material or waste or ruin something. But success, I think, lies somewhere in between ruining it and not going far enough. I think that when you create a work of art, or if you look at a work of art, you bring all the experiences you ever had in your life to it. You interpret it based on those things. And so having a diverse range of experiences in my life, making things out of different materials and working in different ways, adds to what I can do with sculpture. There's a lot of elbow grease involved in making something fair and smooth, and the machine can help do a lot of the grunt work there.
But you did most of it by hand, right?
Yes, the final finessing also takes, I would say, equally as long as the roughing out, maybe longer. There's a lot of ingrained, intangible knowledge that's embodied within your hands and your mind to be able to do that. And so it's not just digital, it's not just machine made, but it's a conversation between the two. And I think it comes out to be something greater than alone.
Tell us a little bit about the first sculpture, the second sculpture, and how you've used the digital process.
I want to learn two things. What happens if I scan something, and what happens when it gets printed, because I didn't understand well enough what could that do. So I made something by hand, and I found something made by nature, and I proposed those to scan. And then I thought, well, I could go one step further and just try to put them together in a virtual space.
Right.
So I did. And then when I got to Italy, thanks to what happens at a residency, I took another risk and made another form that was at the bottom that boosted it up and made it not just sit on the ground. And in between going to Italy and coming back and making the sculpture, I went to India and made a sculpture. And I got to see some of the sculptures that both you and I were taught in university to admire and respect, the Indian sculptures. And they're animated, and they're more vibrant and dynamic. And so I think that second sculpture was influenced by that, and it was influenced by seeing the Laocoon sculpture in person.
Oh, okay.
And the serpent that was going through. So one of the forms kind of reminds you of that in a slight way, I think. But it was actually a scan of a component from life that I know very well and was interested in seeing big and distorted. So
Right.
yeah, I did use the program to stretch the sculpture a bit. Ken Macklin had a really good quote, which was, "I don't talk about sculpture." And I really admired Ken because he works in a rural atmosphere like you or I do now, and I think we make the sculptures to try and figure out our lives. Like, I don't think I get truth from anything as clearly as when I take a leap of faith. But I thought a leap of faith in this material might allow me to work even when my body breaks down and I'm a bit older. I might be able to do digital stuff and see it realized. So the leap of faith comes when I feel like, yes, I think maybe not only tomorrow will I be able to make this, but maybe I'll be able to do it longer. And I got to be honest with you, doing something with the computer takes none of the muscles in my body, and as I'm getting older, they're all getting weaker. Like parts are wearing out, and digital gives me the opportunity. I think I might be able to do some other things.
At some point, there will be more materials that a person can use as well, right? They're talking about print in marble, bronze, stainless steel, all these things. So that opens up a whole other realm of ways of working with materials.
When I first moved to Edmonton, it was about 1982, I guess, and I had the feeling like DeLorean cars were kind of famous at that time. And I remember people in Edmonton talking about making a competitor to the DeLorean. And I feel like maybe there's a potential that something like this will stimulate somebody else to do something even better than what we've done. And maybe this place could be known even more than it already is, because it's an excellent art community.
Yes.
The outcome would be better if it was just the average people that grew up in this city realizing that I might be able to use this technology and do something amazing, and then the city would become a more diverse place where we all run into those surprises.
Touching the whole sculpture, like being able to grip it or feeling the textures or what I've done or what has been made already. It's like, oh, it's grounding, where I found that a lot of my process as I would work, I would then like dust it off and I would wrap around the rope and I would dust it off like this. And it was this embracing action or come closer kind of moment. And then it would settle in to these actions of how the hand would work and how the tool would go against the surface.
So the idea for the marble sculpture was related to things to do with your own health too.
Yes, it's a microscopic look at my lungs and kind of a playful approach in it being like a squeeze ball on a string, these air sacs. And what would that be as a toy? And what would it be as a toy made out of marble, sort of emblemed and respected in this material? So I made this yo-yo that sort of took textures from a pomegranate, and that had this sort of squeeze ball, sort of polyp kind of disease looking quality to it. And I made it into this yo-yo and put a rope around it and squeezed it. It's sort of distanced sculpture. It's on the computer. But being able to navigate and turn it around is something that you can't necessarily do that well in a bigger sculpture. Like I can't take that marble sculpture and flip it upside down to see if the rope carved as beautifully as I can trust that it did in the model when I did it on the program. There is kind of a, like, especially with these shiny pomegranate seeds, these polyps, there's kind of like a want to squeeze them as if they could pop or something, or eat them, which is scary to think of it being diseased. So there's a bit of a discomfort there with sort of like enticing, but I don't know. And that's sort of how I feel that generally we approach illness, is sort of, do we want to talk about it? Do we want to engage with people and sort of be there, be present in what they're going through, but also be like, don't want to catch it, or I don't know enough about it, or can they handle this kind of thing.
So there's other people that may have maladies or even the malady that you have.
Mm-hmm.
If they realize there's a connection, how do you think they'll feel? Do you think that will make them feel like they're not alone?
Oh, of course. I think anything like with chronic pain or chronic illness, it's something that you live with. And then people close to you live with. Some days it's easier, and some days it's playful, sort of like, oh, I made a funny noise from my sad body, and it's funny in that moment, but it's also like as specifically calling attention to, oh, and they're not doing so well. I need to take some inhaler, or I need to take a pause, kind of thing.
Do you see a parallel between wanting control in the art and wanting control of your health?
Yes, definitely. And that's good. It's good to have it sort of in tune of connecting. I always connect my body in this way of finding how it moves into another material. And I think that relaxes me, of being like almost holding up a mirror. It's like, oh, this material has this struggle, this affinity as well. And that calms me down, and like, okay, so if I respond to the material as if I'm responding to my body, and how I push my body, how I push the material, it connects us immediately.
So the consequences of you being alive and surviving your health has allowed you to make sculpture and music. In music, there's an immediate radiation of your energy outwards and affects the room very positively, I might add, because I was part of that. And then the sculpture, though, somebody discovers it, and then it's radiating energy, might be over years.
Yeah.
Or decades. Or
yeah.
You think about that at all?
Memory is so interesting. Like, it's compelling in that way, of what lingers in the mind. I find the senses really do help with memory. So you have the sound, and then playing harp. So maybe that'll make this memory stronger for you.
La nostra zona, la Garfagnana, è una zona che storicamente, circa dal 1900, è conosciuta per l'escavazione del marmo. Il mondo del marmo prima era basato sicuramente, assolutamente su una lavorazione del tutto manuale, quindi molte persone dovevano andare a lavorare manualmente il materiale. Con l'applicazione, con l'arrivo delle nuove tecnologie è diventato tutto più veloce, è diventata più veloce l'escavazione, perché adesso già in cava si scava in maniera diversa, più sicura e anche facendo meno danni ambientali.
I think the stone is timeless, and I think it's the ultimate medium.
The marble's got a spirit to it. It's got an energy to it. It's got a kind of history. It's got the weight of many years behind it. It's got mass. It's got fragility. So there's vulnerability at the same time as having mass, which is something I've never experienced with a material before.
In questa area le lavorazioni si sono susseguite in 100 anni e l'attività e le modalità di estrazione del marmo sono cambiate notevolmente con le tecnologie e anche con le modalità di lavorazione che permettono dei risultati che 100 anni fa erano impensabili. Perciò abbiamo cercato di impiegare nel quartier generale, nelle sedi, i difetti principali dei nostri materiali, però visti sotto l'occhio di un design, in modo da poter far vedere che un difetto non è un difetto, ma è una qualità del materiale. La cooperativa Puana ha creduto fin dall'inizio nel progetto del Digital Stone Project e nelle sculture digitali, perché crede che il futuro del design, delle sculture e della lavorazione specifica del marmo passi anche da questa nuova tecnologia.
Visto che però, come detto, tutto il lavoro artistico, la storia, quindi la parte di lavorazione è sempre stata effettuata nelle zone vicine a noi, ma abbiamo pensato all'epoca di realizzare un progetto che prevedesse l'applicazione dell'ultima tecnologia che il mercato proponeva. Furono acquistati dei robot e delle macchine a 5 assi interpolati, scanner laser, eccetera, e da lì è nato il nostro progetto.
The Digital Stone Project is a non-for-profit organization that I founded around about 2002. In 2012, I came to Italy and met with the guys at Garfagnana Innovazione and realized this would be a perfect location to bring groups of artists to work with their robotic technologies and develop work and engage in new potential ways to work with the computer through robotics. As we think through the history of carving, we know very clearly that the tool, the chisel, always left a mark. I mean, we see this in Bernini and Michelangelo. All of these marks have expression. And I think what we're beginning to see now is artists and architects recognizing that there is a mark that the robot makes. And why shouldn't that be incorporated in some way? How could that mark have a significant aesthetic value that's intrinsic to the form and the design? We're noticing the tool against the marble and the veining, and there's an interesting patterning and dynamic going on there. So I think that we have to really push on how we have control over those tool paths in relationship to the programming.
I like the way that digitally there are so many applications for an STL file or an OBJ file. I like that you can work additively or subtractively, and you can make it exactly how you want it. And I think that enables me to be the true architect of the thing that I'm making. One thing I do love about all the apps is that, speaking about marble, is that it is such a finite and precious material that I feel like I'm not wasting a beautiful resource, because I conceive my idea and the design beforehand.
The digital process also offers a kind of milling dialogue that opens up potential that I hadn't imagined. The milling path, the way that the stone is coming to us, comes with its own spirit and energy, which is really interesting. The person who designed that interface between the robot and me has their mark on the stone. It's very clear. So you can choose to accept that, or you can erase it completely. And it seems appropriate to me to try and keep and accept and modify and riff like a musician would. And that's always been a joy with making sculpture for me, is that sort of riffing with somebody.
My mission for this project was to see what new opportunities we could find, mixing a material with such a long tradition such as marble and sculpting with new processes and new technologies such as robotic carving and procedural modeling and generative modeling. Sculpting is a very analog process, is a very tangible one. So we were interested in exploring how we could bring the experience of manual sculpting a form from the analog world to the digital environment with generative modeling, right? So what we did for this project was we built an environment where any designer can use a 3D tracker to move their hand in 3D space and then trace this virtual surface. And then we used generative modeling to convert that surface into a solid object that had the structural integrity that was required so that we could extract this unique and elegant surface out of a raw block of marble. We thought that using a tangible interface that we could move in three-dimensional space would give us more freedom than traditional interfaces like mice or like touchpads, because sculpting is a very three-dimensional process. You want an interface that gives you that range of three-dimensional freedom.
Nowadays, it's to program the robot for this kind of work, like art and this kind of pieces. There's a lot of tools that help you in the creation of the toolpath, but you still have to do a lot of work. You have to create geometry, surfaces, everything that helps you to keep the control of the machine where you want. The material we choose is an arapescato vagli. We choose that material because between our local material, that is one of the most translucent that we have. There's also some artists. They are kind of digital artists. They want to see the machine, the touch of the machine in the end on the final surface of the sculptors. So they use basically the machine as part of their creative process and not as a medium to create something faster. To realize this piece for Autodesk, it was very challenging because very, very thin. And with marble, it's not so easy to reach kind of thinness.
At the end of the day, we believe that with this piece, we were able to explore and to open up new possibilities to what can be done in the 21st century with a combination of high-end robotics, state-of-the-art software, generative modeling tools. But on top of that, our interest in this project was to be able to create tools that other people, most people in the world could use for the same matter. So, in fact, we've open sourced most of the tools that we did for this project. So with the hope that anybody else, artists, designers, sculptors, architects, could take those tools and then they could also participate from this wonderful experience, which is carving marble with robots. As part of the typical quarrying process, quarrying is actually not a very efficient process because the rock has so many veins and it has so many irregularities that very often a lot of scrap material, a lot of broken rocks are generated. Sometimes they even just throw them to the river. With this project, we were very interested in exploring how, with software, with generative design tools, how perhaps we could give a second chance to all this material and all these pieces that are abandoned and are considered scrap, and perhaps make all this process of marble carving a bit more sustainable and a bit more environmentally friendly. What we did in this project was we actually went to the river and we looked for rocks down in the river, and we chose one that we liked. We fished it, we took it up with a crane, and we brought it back to the fabrication laboratory. And then in the space, we 3D scanned it so that we had a digital representation of this rock.
We do a certain number of scans of the model from different point of view. Then we have to take some reference point on the object and to align all those scans. Once aligned, we have, let's say, a cloud of points of the whole surface that we can export in one of the common file formats.
Once we had that, because it's digital information, you can use generative design to process that information however you want. So what we did was we wrote some algorithms so that we could propagate a pattern on top of that rock. And we also incorporated in those algorithms all the machine instructions that the robot need in order to carve that pattern on top of the surface. That allowed us to create a process where with any input rock, we could get any pattern grooved on top of that rock, and therefore, with procedural workflows, with algorithms, with generative design, we were able to give it a second life by adding value and adding uniqueness to that object.
We made something that was discarded and wasted. We turned it into something useful.
I think what has been really exciting has been Autodesk's support of our project. I think that what has been really wonderful about that sponsorship and proposition has been to give sort of free enterprise to the participants to really explore potential ways of working and using Autodesk software as a platform and see what new can be brought forward in that regard.
I really look forward to seeing much more experimentation, much more research, and much more forward thinking from this combination of incredibly talented artists, incredibly savvy and expert engineers, and people willing to innovate and push the boundaries of what's possible in this field.